Breaking news right now. Tom Price has resigned as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. CBS News Political Director Steve Chaggaris joins me now. Steve, was this really a surprise considering the fact that at every opportunity President Trump said that he really wasn't happy with Secretary Price's travel on expensive aircraft?
I think the hint to me was when he referred to Price as a fine man. If you remember when right before Steve Bannon was dismissed from the White House or resigned from the White House, however you want to call it, he called him a good man in public. I think that's sort of a signal that he's trying to be a nice guy while shoving these guys out the door. Look, this is a really bad look for President Trump to have a cabinet member spending reportedly up to or over $1 million of taxpayer money to fly around, not only just for work but for other reasons. This is a president who campaigned on draining the swamp, on changing how Washington works and how business is done in this city. And to have your Health and Human Services Secretary flying around and spending that kind of taxpayer money, that's not consistent with what the president had campaigned on. So he said it. He said the optics look terrible, and in that sense, it's not a surprise. Reportedly, the president was irate behind the scenes about these stories, and it's not just Price. There are others in his cabinet who are dealing with these kinds of stories, not at the level as Tom Price was. But these are the kinds of things that are just distractions. This is a president who's trying to get his tax reform plan out there and get people to listen to that framework and his plan. And these stories overwhelm that. And so I think the president realizes that, realizes it's inconsistent with what he campaigned on, and ended it today.
Yes. I want to read the statement from the White House here. Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price offered his resignation earlier today, and the president accepted. The president intends to designate Don J. Wright of Virginia to serve as acting secretary effective at 11:59 p.m. on September 29, 2017. Mr. Wright currently serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health and Director of the Office of Disease and Prevention and Health Promotion. Steve, by my count, this is he is the 8th advisor or cabinet member to resign, and it's only been 9 months. He campaigned on, as you said, draining the swamp, but he also promised to bring in only the best people, to surround himself with the very best people, business people, etc. You talk about optics. That's an optic that doesn't look very good either.
Sure, and he's going through some growing pains. I think this should be expected. This is a man who's never held elective office in his life. He is a businessman who came into this government. There are going to be growing pains, and we've seen it with previous presidents who have government experience. We saw it with Bill Clinton. His first year was a series of false starts with members of his cabinet, with advisors, firings, people quitting. It took him a year really to sort of right that ship before his administration really took off. And people don't really remember that first year of the Clinton administration, but it was pretty rough. We're seeing that with this president. The question is, you're 8 months into his presidency. There's been a lot of movement. What is going to be the result of all this movement? Is it going to be some positive results? I think people will say that replacing Reince Priebus with John Kelly has been a positive move for this president. He's streamlined the operation in the White House. It seems like things are going a little bit more smoothly in terms of running the White House. So you could make an argument that's a positive move. But we'll see what happens in the long run. At the end of the day, voters don't care about this stuff. They care about what the president gets done. And if all these moves help him accomplish what he promised on the campaign trail, then that will help him ultimately. But right now it's too early to tell that, and I think ultimately we'll be looking at first the midterms and then of course in 2020 to see how voters are reacting to what the president's done, not necessarily to all the moves he's made with the chess pieces.
Tom Price wasn't the only cabinet member who has been criticized for his use of expensive travel. Who are some of the others, and do you imagine that we're going to see other heads roll here?
Well, we'll see. I mean, this Price thing spiraled out of control in the sense that it was a huge amount of money, and it was a really egregious use of private and military planes to take some of these trips. You're seeing Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin also getting sort of roped into this scandal, if you want to call it that. Much lesser scale, although in Pruitt's case, it seems to be growing by the day. So we'll see what happens here. I mean, again, this goes against a lot of the things that the president was saying as a candidate in terms of changing how business is done in Washington and draining the swamp. These kinds of things. The people that voted for Donald Trump don't want to see this kind of behavior from their government officials. And you know, we'll see how the president handles this, but the Price thing was just really spiraling out of control. That was the story of yesterday and today, and again, getting in the way of the president's agenda. I think you know, we shouldn't be surprised by this, but also keep in mind too, you know, Tom Price was sort of on thin ice. You remember a couple of months ago, before the first Obamacare vote in the Senate, the president called out Tom Price on stage, saying if he didn't get enough votes in the Senate, then perhaps he would fire him then. So, you know, Tom Price is sort of, it's not just, perhaps it's not just about the planes. Perhaps there's a political reason here too, and that might be, you know, a difference between him and what's going on with the others who are dealing with this issue.
Well, the other thing that's different about Price too is that he wasn't exactly a political outsider. He was a former congressman. He was a doctor before then, but so you had to think that he had to be aware of what it would look like to spend this kind of money when President Trump came in and said that he was going to save money for the government, that he was going to save money on the new jet, that he was going to save money on, even he said earlier today, on the way that he handled the recent disasters in Florida and Texas. So some of the other resignations have been because they didn't fit, they didn't work well, they didn't operate within the confines of what Washington expects, but that wasn't the case here.
There's no question that Price should have known better. As a man who served in Congress, he understands how the government works. He understands all this stuff. And, you know, for him to really so blatantly do this with his travel, knowing what the president had said about it, but also being in this city and knowing how it works, I think that was probably a strike against him as well. Keep in mind the others that are embroiled in this potentially. Brian Zinke, former congressman, but Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, not of Washington. It's not an excuse, but perhaps getting used to how things are done, especially a guy who's coming from Wall Street, where things are done completely differently when it comes to how you get yourself around the world. So, you know, Price should have known better, you think, from being in this town and seeing how it worked, but also understanding where the president was coming from on this.
Steve, were you surprised that it seems like just less than an hour ago that the president came out and spoke to reporters on a fairly, for a length of period that was somewhat unusual for him, and that he didn't make the announcement then. He chose to leave for New Jersey and then let this, I guess, come out by a statement, an official statement from the White House. Why do you think that is? Because it seems to me that he's the kind of person who wants to be seen as a leader. So he just said he wasn't pleased. You'll find out later what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it was in motion. There was a resignation that was offered and it was accepted, and so perhaps he just wanted that process to play out. The other thing on this is, you know, he's not the kind of guy who's out there and firing people, as you've seen. You know, he's letting these things sort of happen. You mentioned these eight people. None of them have been the president going on television, pointing his finger into the camera and saying you're fired, like he did during The Apprentice. He sort of lets the process play out, and in this case, is a little bit more of a process because this is a cabinet member. So, you know, you have to accept that resignation. So I think that he was probably just letting that process play out. Didn't want to get ahead of it, although. He was pretty much telegraphing what was going to happen in his remarks as he was walking out of the White House today.
Yeah, and Steve, if I know you're going to find out what went on behind the scenes. We'll be hearing that soon. Steve Chaggaris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Don.
And once again, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Thomas Price, offered his resignation after days of criticism over his choice of expensive travel. This is CBSN, always on.